What is up, researchers? Dr. Charlie Collins here. We will be talking about sampling today. So, what is sampling? Sampling is the process of selecting a subset of cases from a larger population. We'll talk about that. What it does is it estimates the characteristics of the whole population, and we will talk about probability versus non-probability types of sampling. So the learning objectives today is to be able to define sampling and explain its importance, particularly in the social sciences, differentiate between probability and non-probability sampling, describe key characteristics of the different sampling methods. There's multiple sampling methods within probability and non-probability, and then understand the factors to consider when we are sampling. So what I want to do here is I want to run with a running research question and to use as our running example. And so my running example here is the news media politically biased? Right, so we'll talk about ways in which we can sample here, thinking about this particular research question. So first, let's talk about the sampling procedure. So what sampling does is it takes a population, and what we have to do is we have to define that population. What is that population created from? What does it represent? And so we have to think about what are the cases in the population. If we think about our running research question here as the news media bias, then our population might be something like news media reports. And so as you're doing your research, it's important to define what that population is. It could be individual people, right, with some common characteristic, something like that. So it's important to understand what the boundary around the population is. So again, if we're talking about like news media reports, for example, we really have to think about what is included and what's excluded from that population of news media reports. So our television reports, news media reports, or opinion pieces, news media reports, is anything that appears in a print media journal news, and is that a media source? So we have to think about that, right? Once we have the population set and bounded, then we have to identify the sampling frame. A lot of the times the sampling frame is the population, and the sampling frame is simply the group of cases under which we are going to collect our data, right? So the sampling frame could be smaller. An example could be, so let's say the population is news media reports, across a variety of different sort of channels and papers and stuff like that. And then let's say we want to sort of shrink that down to the past year and want to do something within the past year, right? So that shrinks down the sampling frame. And then from that, we have the sample, right? And so the sample are the actual cases that we use for our study, right? And so it's those specific cases that are included in our study. So as you can see, it shrinks down from the population as a larger set of cases down to the sampling frame and then finally the sample. And so the way we have to do this is we have to first identify our individual cases, right? As I mentioned, so what is included as a case and what is excluded as a case. We have to define the population, right? And so again, who's included and excluded from that population, or what is included and excluded from that population. We have to choose our sampling method, which I will go over here briefly or in a second. And then we have to collect our sample. And so there's two types of sampling procedures. There are probability sampling procedures and non-probability sampling procedures. Probability sampling is when the sample can equate to the population and we can make inferences about the population based on the sample. This is typically statistical inferences based on on the sample, because each case within the population has an equal chance of being included in the sample. So that's important to note, that each case has an equal chance of being included, right? And so that's the key characteristic of probability sampling, is that the sample, the cases in the sample based on randomness and probability are equal to, in whatever characteristic, the cases in the population, right? And so they're representative of the population. Non-probability sampling, however, is not representative of the population, right? And so there's no assumption that the sample represents a specific characteristic about the population. So we're not allowed, we just can't make inferences about the population based on the sample. And so if we are to, again, test our claim that the news, whether the news media is biased, and we're using non-probability sampling, then we're not going to be able to actually figure out if that's true or not, right? And so it's important to understand the types of sampling you're using in these processes. So first I'm going to go over probability, the different types of probability sampling, and then the types of non-probability samples. So probability sampling procedures, there are three types. There's simple random sample, systematic sampling, and stratified sampling, and cluster sampling. So we'll go over each of those. So simple random sampling is when the sample, the cases within the population, so let's say whatever news media reports that we have defined as part of our population, those cases, they have an equal chance, each case has an equal chance of being selected. And the way that happens is through some lottery, some random assignment, something like that. So however we can first identify all of those cases, and then create a sampling procedure that creates the equal probability of every individual having an equal chance of being selected as part of that sample. And so again, if we're using news media, for example, we would create an entire list of all the possible cases that could be included for our study, to examine if there's bias in those cases. And then we would randomly pick out those cases, right? So it could be like a random number generator that would pick out those cases, something like that, right? To identify which of those cases would be included in the sample. And actually, yeah. Systematic sampling, on the other hand, is taking is when when every nth case is selected for study, right? And so what you do is you create a situation where every let's say 4th out of 10th case is included in the sample. So you'd have to figure out a way, again, if we're using news media as our example, identifying all the different reports that would be included, each case that would be included in our study. And then we would randomly pick a number, usually 1 through 10, and then select every 5th case or every 10th case or every 9th case, right? So we would do that systematically. So we would be sort of going down and counting a line saying, okay, this is the 5th case, we're going to take this. This is the 10th case, we're going to take this. This is the 15th case, right? So every 5th interval. So it's up to you as a researcher to identify which interval you want to use for that, and then sample that way. So that's another way to randomly sample, and still the population and the sample are equatable. The third type of probability sampling here is called stratified sampling. And what stratified sampling is it separates the population into subgroups, or what we call strata, and then randomly selects within those subgroups, right? So this is often done when people are interested in looking at differences across race, for example, within a population. If we're using our news media as an example here, what we would do is we would say, let's say we need to take an equal sample from Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, whatever we have defined as those different components of the population, and then randomly select cases within each of those, right? So the idea here is that you get a fairly equal sample across those different strata, and that each of the strata are equally represented in your sample. And the idea here is, again, it helps with your ability to compare cases, and make inferences and make judgments about the strata or the different types of groups that you see in the population. The fourth case here is called cluster sampling. Cluster sampling is similar to stratified random sampling. The difference is that in this case, the population is separated into what we call clusters. Typically, and the media example isn't a great one for this one because it's hard to identify what a cluster could be. But this is often used in like neighborhood studies, for example, where the population is separated into sort of naturally defined clusters. And in this case, clusters are oftentimes neighborhoods or geographic areas, right? And so to sort of switch the example a little bit, if we're doing a study about the city of Seattle, for example, we could, and we want to survey residents within Seattle, we could implement a cluster sampling approach where we break the city up into different neighborhoods and say, okay, then now we're going to randomly sample within each of those neighborhoods, right? And so the benefit of this is that you are able to get representation across the city within those neighborhoods. And so the neighborhoods help sort of cluster the population and help us as researchers be able to identify which clusters are included and which clusters have not been included. And so those are the 4 probability sampling procedures. Keep in mind that sometimes these probability sampling procedures can actually be layered on top of each other, right? So you can take a stratified random sample within a cluster sample approach, for example, or a systematic sampling approach within a stratified random sampling approach. So they can be stacked on top of each other. The main piece here to think about is that the ways in which we sample, if we're using probability sampling, allows us to make inferences or judgments about the population based on the sample, right? And so that's an important piece to this, is that understanding. Next, we're going to turn to non-probability sampling procedures. And so this is, the 3 of these are convenient sampling, purposive sampling, and snowball sampling. I should note as well, if I haven't mentioned this already, that probability sampling is typically used with quantitative research, and non-probability sampling is typically used with qualitative research. And the reason for that is quantitative research is often trying to make inferences about the population, whereas qualitative research is really more about understanding a context or an experience of a group of people, as opposed to making judgments or inferences about the population based on the results of the sample, if that makes sense. And so in this case, the sample and the population are not equatable, right? We still have a defined population, but the sample that we take from that population is not equatable, and it's non-random, right? So there's bias in there in some way, and the sample cannot make inferences about the population. So first, convenient sampling. Convenient sampling is by far the least useful type of sampling, even for qualitative data. And the reason for that is you are sampling from easily accessible cases. And so that what it does is it leaves out a large portion of the population, and it can create really clear systematic error and systematic bias within your research, right? And so an example of doing this with our running example of the news media would be to say, well, I have access to all the news reports on CNN, and so I'm going to analyze CNN to identify if there's bias. And what that does is it excludes all the other news media sources, right? And so you're only focusing on that one just solely because you have access to it. And that really doesn't do much for us, right? Another example of this would be in another type of study would be to be sending out a survey on Facebook, for example, or any other social media, Twitter or whatever else, right? Because you're systematically sampling from people you know or people you're connected with, and it excludes everybody else, right? And so convenience sampling is the really the least useful form of sampling. Purposive sampling, on the other hand, is a type of sample where intentional selection of cases, cases are selected intentionally based on some relevant criteria, right? So going to our example of asking if the news media is biased, if we want to ask the question, is CNN biased, right? Then we can sample CNN specifically and ignore the other types of news media, right? And so that's different than convenient sampling, right? Let's say it's not a convenient way to do this research, but we're doing it purposefully because we're interested in that specific question. Qualitative researchers use this all the time, and they use it to study specific contexts, right? So if they're doing ethnography, for example, and they're embedding themselves in a specific community or organization or neighborhood, they're purposefully sampling because they're purposefully interested in that specific case or that specific context or phenomenon. And so it's the intentional selection based on some relevant criteria as identified by the researcher. And then finally, we have snowball sampling. Snowball sampling is also very useful, and it's a sampling method that I've used. I've also used purposive sampling in my qualitative research. And what it does is it's where participants recruit new participants, right? So you may have an interview with one participant, and that participant recruits somebody close to them who fits the criteria of the study. And again, it's usually a situation where you're doing this is often used in combination with purposive sampling, right? So what they're doing is, let's say, in my case with anti-racist activists, right? I was really interested in looking at the developmental process of anti-racist activists, and so because I'm not embedded in that community, I would ask the activists after I interviewed them, hey, is there anybody else I can talk to? Do you mind giving me some names? And then it snowballs. And so that's the idea behind snowball sampling. And again, it's often used in combination with purposive sampling to get at a specific sort of concept or criteria. An example with our news media reports would be, let's say we would sample news media that referenced other media, and so we took that route, right? And so we sort of use the referencing method to sample cases. So to sum up here, non-probability sampling procedures are the three that we have are convenience, purposive, and snowball. And they are not, the samples here, the cases in the sample are not representative of the population. We can't really make inferences about the population based on those samples. But that's not the purpose, right? The purpose is really to understand a phenomenon or a context in detail, and that's why it's primarily used by qualitative researchers. So our learning objectives today, our goal here was to define our sample and explain its importance, differentiate between the different types of sampling techniques, describe the key characteristics of different sampling methods, and then to understand the factors to consider when sampling. Thank you for listening.